Since we're talking about the land, we do want to start with a land acknowledgement and
Yeah,
acknowledge the territories in which we live, learn, and do our work. And I'll start by saying that I'm located on the unceded, unsurrendered territories of the Lekwungen and Sinchothan speaking peoples, including the WSÁNEĆ, Esquimalt, Songhees, Sooke, and Chianu nations. Together, we recognize the original and rightful owners of these lands and are thankful to be guests upon it. We respect the history of the land and its original people, stretching back to time immemorial and stretching forward for generations to come.
where I am here with Sonic Territory, the language is Senchothan. And there's a tradition that I'm of raising our hands to it. So raising my hands to you is a welcome, a thanks, an acknowledgement, and haishka, haishka siam, which is to welcome and thank, and particularly again acknowledge we're on the territory of the Coast Salish peoples and of all different languages, but the traditional guardians of this territory to whom we are very grateful.
We believe that strong climate policy is not necessarily a partisan issue, but it's a human rights issue. And so we just wanted to know what your thoughts were on that.
To me, it's a very good analogy as to the COVID pandemic. This is not a partisan issue. You have to listen to the science as much as on COVID, uncertain science when this pandemic first arrived. Well, we've had much more certainty on the science for the last number of decades around climate. And the responsibility of elected people is to listen to the science and take the required steps, which will require far more than Canada has done to date.
Yeah. So when we talk about our government, right, they have a responsibility to govern for the people. So you wrote in the National Observer, quote, "I call on the Liberals and NDP to deliver a bill that meets the demands of science and our kids," end quote. So how do you see Bill C-12 setting us up for generational justice and climate action, or injustice and climate inaction?
My big problem with Bill C-12, which should be everybody's problem with it, is that it is constructed around a flawed presentation of the science. I won't say it's necessarily dishonest, but it's certainly wrong. Because while the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which of course is the world's largest peer reviewed science body, and it's spoken very clearly about how we can hold to the Paris Agreement target. And the Paris Agreement target is a global target, and it is to make sure that we keep global average temperature increase to as far below 2 degrees Celsius as possible, and preferably to 1.5 degrees Celsius as compared to the global average temperature before the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. But the IPCC also said very clearly there's only one pathway that they could find. This was in an October 2018 special report on 1.5 degrees. There's only one pathway that allows us to hold to 1.5 degrees. And it requires massive cuts in greenhouse gases before 2030. It requires essentially a curve that looks like this. It's a shape, it's going to go like down fast. It's not that we can get to net zero by 2050, which in your head becomes this little chunk, 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 chunk. You got 3 decades. Oh, that's way good. Or, almost 3 decades from 2021 to 2050. And by the time we get there, if we're at net zero, we're safe. That's the lie created by the way this bill is put forward, because no science supports that. If we hold to 1.5 degrees, it's because we cut emissions more than in half before 2030.
So this bill, with its sort of assumptions and lacking of strength, leaves us with this burden upon future generations of not only Canadians, but youth and our children all around the world.
There is major pressure from the world's scientists and from many governments that if we don't collectively, as a community of nations, up our game, improve our targets, and show a commitment to get there, the window on 1.5 will have closed by 2030. We run the risk of looking at runaway global warming, which I'm sure is a concept that you know about, and I see you shaking your head. Yes, I mean, that's what we're trying to avoid now. We cannot avoid climate change. We cannot avoid the climate crisis. We will be in climate emergency for the rest of this century. There's no way to turn back the clock and suddenly get a hospitable climate where you don't have increasingly scary droughts and fires and floods, et cetera. We're in that now. That's the world we're in. But we have to hold it such that, if possible, we can hold to a 1.5 degree global average temperature increase. If we can hold to that, we have a chance to hold on to Arctic ice. Not all of it, it's melting fast, but we can hold on to some Arctic ice. We can hold on to most of the world's permafrost and keep it from thawing. These are things we must do because those events themselves, if they happen, unleash more global warming, which becomes unstoppable.
When we read it, we were shocked that there was not a lot of attention to accountability. And, you know, we know that people can talk, but it's hard to keep people accountable when there's nothing in place. So we actually had a question that kind of touched on that, where you pointed out that in New Zealand, there's quite a bit of a climate accountability in their bill. And they've set requirements for engagement with Indigenous peoples. But Bill C-12, their committee, we haven't heard from many Indigenous or youth witnesses. So
none. There were no witnesses from the Indigenous nations. There were no youth because they were in such a, sorry for interrupting. I'm sorry. But it was, Chris, it was a shocker to me that we had 7.5 hours of evidence from anyone from non-government and or Indigenous groups. Indigenous nations, of course, are government, but we heard the Minister of Environment and the Environment Canada staff for an hour and a half. And then we had 7.5 hours of everybody else, which didn't include any Indigenous voices, no youth voices, no scientists.
How might Canada ensure that, you know, if they didn't have a seat at the table, how would Indigenous, marginalized, and young people like us be heard and accounted for in these climate policies that our government is drafting?
There will be opportunities to consult about targets and plans. My big fear is that and there's a multi-stakeholder committee that's been established. The other countries with basically the best practices didn't use the model of a multi-stakeholder committee with some industry people and environmentalists and First Nations and labor, and then they'll sort of duke it out and come up with an answer. That inevitably is a slow process. What you really want is an ongoing, well-funded, science and expert-based body that advises government as a whole. And on climate, we're still about the back of the pack, and people need to know that and take it forward to individual members of parliament, to the prime minister, to the minister of environment, say, we're not satisfied. This isn't close to what is required. Improve your target before COP26 and just find every way to push that message.
And as it goes through, will there be, is this it? Is there any chance for Canada's climate bill to be strengthened after another election? Or?
But Monique Posé from the Bloc Québécois brought forward an amendment that I supported. And amazingly enough, we got the Conservatives and the NDP to support it, but not the Liberals. And it allows for a periodic review of the act. So that does give us a chance to improve it later. And as long as that goes through at report stage from the House of Commons, the bill will be a bit improved in that respect, that we might have another chance to get back to it before 2030 to strengthen it. And the history of legislation is once a week bill, like the Species at Risk Act. I worked so hard on getting that passed in the early 1990s, and we accepted a bunch of compromises because everyone said, well, it's better to get something than nothing. And the more time that goes by, I keep thinking, we shouldn't have taken that. That's just, I mean, it only applies to endangered species if they're on federal land. You know, so when you're fighting the logging of old growth in Fairy Creek and they find an endangered screech owl and they say, well, we can't do anything about it because it's not on federal land. Gosh, you know, that we should never have given up on fighting for what we needed. And I hear those words now coming from much, much younger environmentalists in different groups looking at climate bills and thinking, let's get it, let's nail it down because it's as good as we're going to get for now. But it's not what's needed. It's nowhere near what's needed.
We do want to let you know that we will be moving forward. We're going to we have more op-eds planned. We have a letter which we'll send to Senator Rosa Galvez.
She is a hero. Yes, she's wonderful. She's she's an environmental scientist herself in her background.
Yeah. So we're still working, even though it's moved to the Senate.
It's really very cool that you're with the Jane Goodall Youth Council. I'm very deeply grateful to you for your commitment, because we desperately need young people who just keep speaking truth to power.